Dialogue between Mennonites and Catholics. He continues to call himself a Mennonite Catholic, which is a nice combination. Recent books, Sharing Peace, Mennonites and Catholics in Conversation. He co-edited that with Margie File. Unlearning Protestantism, Sustaining Christian Community in an Unstable Age. And if you ever want to read a thorough exegesis of the meaning of the Benedict vow of stability, read that book. Just Policing, Not War, an Alternative to World Violence. The title of Gerald's presentation this evening is We Too Are Guests, Coming to Terms with Diaspora. Please give Gerald a warm Collegeville welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back at St. John's. Well, you know the headlines: globalization, lost jobs, jobs gained, immigrants, refugees, Muslims, nationalist resurgence in the United States and other countries, calls to build that wall, charges of xenophobia, outsourcing that hurts us, and sweatshops that hurt them. The internet, creating both links between people and echo chambers for the like-minded. Trump, the evangelical vote, the Catholic vote, resurgent tribalism, contesting resurgent nationalisms, globalization. You've been drilling down into these issues by listening to the experience of immigrant communities here in Minnesota. Actually, I should probably say recent immigrant communities. After all, everyone in the U.S. has roots in immigrant communities in the U.S. except Native Americans. And it's good to remember that we should be guests here. So here's my argument. Oops, get this thing. For Christians to respond, even to understand and locate ourselves within this numbingly complex of interconnected phenomena, we need to go all in on immigration reform. Now, the reform I have in mind here is not, first of all, policy reform, as surely as that is needed, and as much as Christian communities should have to offer. I refer rather to our Christian need for a thoroughgoing reform of our own sense of identity. Indeed, our very conception of citizenship. Our ways of sometimes resisting the claims of the nations and societies in which we live, and of contributing to those societies, to their peace, their shalom, their common good. In other words, a reform perhaps of our ecclesiology, our social ethic, our sense of our own baptismal citizenship, our own status as guests. Oops, I was supposed to be... Here's where I'm going. Let me start. Notice, if you can read it, it's a little smaller than I expected. Giving you tips as sort of where I am as I go tonight. Need to go all in on immigration reform. What does that mean? What I'll be arguing is the church is by definition a people that lives in diaspora, a transnational nation, if we can live with that paradox perhaps, that crosses borders and lives among many peoples. Globalization is forcing us to recognize what it was always supposed to mean to be a global Catholic people. Christians whose primary loyalty is to be in Christ rather than the nation state where Christians reside. Living out solidarity with one another in ways that transcend ethnic and nationalist loyalties. The practice of hospitality, then, begins not from a position of hosts who are in control, but in recognition that we too are guests, hence my title. Now that's a lot of words on one screen, so we'll be unpacking it. And again, as if you need a reminder of where we are in the argument, look here: becoming guests, embracing diaspora, relearning Catholic, negotiating borders. But first, continue a little bit with preview and review. I want, how many of you have attended most of this series? The monks, of course, many others. I came up for the very first one and very much enjoyed Phil Steger's presentation. So I want to begin with a short YouTube clip of something that he said, and as kind of my starting point. So, assuming this works, right?
I think those of us who believe in the God of Abraham and read or recognize the Bible as containing revelations of who that God is must recognize and conclude that God has chosen one medium of encounter and revelation and privileged it through every other. And that's migration. And it starts very early in the Bible. Eden is our home. That's what the Bible tells us. The Garden of Eden is our home. That is where we are supposed to be living, in union with God. And it didn't start with emigration. It started with self-exile. We expelled ourselves from that. And the departure of Adam and Eve from the garden is the divergence in human history. It's where human history began to be a thing that's separate from divine history. Up until the expulsion, human history and divine history were the same. Lived in the same home. And the rest of the Bible is the story of God going out to find people wherever they are and trying to bring them back home into union with himself. That's the story of the Bible. It starts there, and in the end, the parousia, thanks Bill Cahoy, is that homecoming. When we are all gathered in the Father's house together. That's the prodigal son.
So Phil went on to lay that out. That's kind of the overall arc. I gave you the overall arc. Eden, Noah, Abraham, Israel detained in detention. Well, on and on. Down through Jesus, the incarnation, Phil said, the most startling migration of all. God coming to human beings, and so on. Migration, a privileged means of revelation. Which means that it might be wise for us, as I say, to recognize ourselves as guests in this world, guests in other cultures. Of course, offering hospitality, but it's always a two-way street. So we need an ethic of guesthood. Yes, an ethic of hospitality, but more than that, I'm at least playing with the idea right recently in my head. Let's start with an ethic of guesthood. We'll never be good hosts if we don't first know how to be guests, to recognize ourselves in diaspora, first and also and always. I want to point out a passing remark that Pope Paul VI made, 1975 apostolic letter, Evangelii Nuntiandi. It's kind of giving guidance about mission work, evangelization, and so on. The context, they released it on purpose 10 years to the day after the release of the great document, kind of the climax of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes. He's trying to reset the balance insofar as some people after Vatican II said, well, we're more generous towards other religions. Maybe we don't need to even do missionary work at all, and so on. So he wants to affirm, no, we have a continuing task of evangelization and so on. So that's in the context where he's starting to then lay out, how does this work? And he's going to go on to say, of course, we need to do more than just live out the gospel. We need to proclaim, but we do first need to live out the gospel in our lives. Above all, the gospel must be proclaimed by witness. Take a Christian or handful of Christians who, in the midst of their own community, show their capacity for understanding and acceptance, their sharing of life and destiny with other people, their solidarity with the efforts of all for whatever is noble and good. In other words, they have a certain identity, but they're engaged in a helpful way in their society, and so on. Jumping to the end of this, through this wordless witness, these Christians stir up irresistible questions in the hearts of those who see how they live. What's this have to do with diaspora? Well, hold on a second. All Christians are called to this living witness, and in this way, they can be real evangelizers. And then he adds a little kicker. Remember that popes use the royal we, so we here means I. We are thinking especially of the responsibility incumbent on immigrants in the country that receives them. I ran across this years ago, and it's astounded me ever since. The paradigm for witness is migrant communities living out their faith in wider society, contributing to that society, prompting questions, inviting conversation, then sharing their faith. The norm, the paradigm then for all Christians is life in diaspora. Imagine yourselves immigrants to get evangelization right, to get our social ethic right. Imagine yourself as migrants living out in a positive way. We could go back to that quote. This isn't a sectarian vision, like we're just kind of holding our own in this hostile environment. No, they're contributing to the society where they are, but they have a clear identity that prompts questions, invites conversation. So I'm suggesting that we all need to embrace life in diaspora. I want to do a conceptual reboot and sort of thinking about who we are. And if you've heard, 2 or 3 of you have maybe heard me do this. So if you ask this question, so hold back, don't give the spoiler. So here's the question. How many nations are there in the world? What's that?
220.
220? Okay, I've heard it more like 190, 193 members of the UN, in that range, certainly, if we're talking about nation states. But that wasn't my question. How many nations are there in the world? Anthropologists conservatively estimate it as 5,000 or 6,000 if you go by language groups. That's the best way to kind of identify that. And then there's some that would say many, maybe more, because then even language groups will sometimes split into tribes and so on. So there's a sense in which groups are nations without being nation states. Most nations of the world can't control territory, which is what a nation state does. Think of the Lakota, think of the Ojibwe. They have a certain recognition as nations even in our in our federated system. Zulu, lots of groups. Well, if that's the case, then we can think of the church itself as a nation, a transnational nation insofar as it exists crossing many other borders, many other nations. 1 Peter 1, Peter writing, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in the diaspora, gives different towns. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, etc. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. And then a little later, he returns again, Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles. So I want to give 3 historical markers for rethinking a little bit our identity. First of all, maybe it should be obvious. It certainly should be obvious, but it hasn't always been obvious. Jesus was a Jew. Centuries of anti-Semitism have sought to obscure the obvious. And why? Part of the impulse within anti-Semitism was this. European Christians who had ceased to see themselves as a diaspora people and who had confused their own baptismal identities with that of blood and soil, Blut und Boden, I've not forgotten all my German that I once learned, were threatened by a people living among themselves who had an independent identity. Jews thus became Europe's archetypical, untrustworthy others. And Christians either downplay Jesus' Jewishness at best, or at worst constructed theories of Jews as Christ killers, which serve to extract Jesus from his Jewishness. Why is this relevant? Well, the Jewish intellectuals, American Jewish intellectuals Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin write, there's a sense in which Israel was born in exile. In other words, not just driven into exile later, but born within and into exile. In this reading, later diaspora is but a return, they say, to the material conditions of nomadic life and to the radical project of being a nation by linkage through time and shared history, more than and sometimes without territorial control over space. And they're critical, by the way, of Israeli policies towards the Palestinians and are trying to give a different vision of how to live together. Early Christians then saw themselves as a diaspora people. There are a number of metaphors, images among patristic scholars that confirm that this was not just, well, we've got to live in exile, we've got to because we're forced into it, not just a missionary tactic, but a sense of their self-identity. Resident aliens, exiles, pilgrims on a journey to another land. More controversial, even then, a third race, or genos. It doesn't quite mean what race now means to us. Neither Jew nor Gentile. Citizenship in heaven, anticipated by citizenship in the commonwealth of all humanity. To elaborate on any of these would require a separate talk, so I just want to illustrate one of those motifs. Recall that for Socrates, in the ancient world, when given a choice between exile and death, exile was worse, so he chose death. But Cyprian, in 3rd century North Africa, and Basil the Great in 4th century Cappadocia in Asia Minor have a different answer in reply to interrogators who threatened them with exile. Basil the Great, banishment is impossible for me, who am confined by no limit of place, counting my own, neither the land where I now dwell, nor all of the places into which I might be hurled, or rather counting it all as God's, whose guest and dependent I am. Or then Cyprian, as quoted by his biographer, To others, it is a severe punishment to live outside their own city. To the Christian, the whole of this world is one home. Wherefore, though he were banished into a hidden and secret place, yet associated with the affairs of his God, he cannot regard it as an exile. In addition, while honestly serving God, he's a stranger even in his own city. In other words, because Christians were not entirely at home anywhere, they could be at home everywhere. Because they were at home everywhere, they were not unambiguously at home anywhere. This worldview, I think, survived even into Augustine, 100 years after the great watershed of Constantine, Christianity gaining acceptance and then official status a few decades later in the Roman Empire. The power of the church's formative self-understanding as a pilgrim people living in exile, as resident aliens amid many cultures and nations whose good they seek, is evident as it not only survives in the thought of St. Augustine, 100 years after Constantine, but becomes his definitive, though often overlooked, word about how to stay faithful now that Christianity enjoyed access to Roman power. At the climax of Augustine's long march through history and beyond in City of God, his final word about how citizens of the heavenly city should live within the earthly city while their pilgrimage continued was to return to this very model. Citizens, he said, should identify with the Hebrews in Babylonian exile, to whom the prophet Jeremiah wrote, seeking the shalom, the peace, the welfare of the city in which they now found themselves, but precisely as those who knew a higher loyalty. Augustine might seem to have helped Christianity ally with the Roman Empire, but in the end he confirmed that the church could never fully settle down there. So the church, to sum this up, the church is by definition a people that lives in diaspora. Globalization is forcing us to recognize what has always been true about the church. As we intermix among cultures, I like to say everybody's in diaspora now. Even if you see yourself as the majority, part of the majority white privileged culture in the U.S., expand the borders economically, and then you're a minority in the larger world, and we're all interacting. So we're all in diaspora, intermixed with other peoples. Diaspora, I argue, and of course I'm a Christian ethicist, so I like a elegant theory, maybe a little bit too much, but diaspora provides a supple, flexible social ethic. It is ready to be stubbornly countercultural when necessary, but without being, I got ahead of my notes. I want to give you a little bit of, remind you a little bit of some Catholic inside baseball. You know, Catholics like to proclaim themselves as theologically both and on any number of matters. But that means we also live with tensions. So we're pulled, therefore, in the tension. On one hand, you can think of sort of stay in the loop, inside the beltway Catholic thinkers. Maybe continue, and again, I know this is inside baseball for some, but appealing to John Courtney Murray, defending cultural engagement, attending red or blue masses and Al Smith dinners without a second thought, because we want to be close to power. There's that edge. And then on the other hand, and of course I have to say I'm not convinced it's very Benedictine here, I have to say, but the Benedict option Catholics, arguing for a countercultural witness because they're starting to despair of the social order. A diaspora social ethic helps us find our way through this Scylla and Charybdis dilemma. It's ready to be stubbornly countercultural when necessary, but without being sectarian. It prefers to engage culture positively, but knows it cannot so assimilate as to be taken captive. It tells us how to appropriate our own immigrant experiences, in this case as American Catholics, which can be a rich resource, but have too often become the occasion for a sort of overcompensating and showing how hyper-patriotic we are as Catholics. So to illustrate how this can work, why it can be a creative tension, I want to turn to those stubborn Jewish boys in Babylon. I say it this way because I'm not sure they were actually boys, they were probably young men, but that's how I heard it in Sunday school, right? And compare the book of Jeremiah with the book of Daniel. Jeremiah 29, the background to Jeremiah 29 is that after a long slide into unfaithfulness, God punishes the people by allowing the empire from the east to dismantle the Davidic dynasty that was supposed to be perpetual. The best and the brightest of the Hebrew people are carried into forced exile. Jeremiah had seen it coming and been persecuted for being a prophet of doom, but now he's vindicated. So the exiles write to him and ask, what next? Seek the welfare, and the word in Hebrew can be health, can be peace, shalom, of the city, the well-being of the city where I have sent you into, God is speaking here through Jeremiah, where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, its shalom, you will find your welfare. Settle down, raise families, build houses, as you can see there on the screen. You've probably maybe heard this, seek this, the peace of the city as a kind of a precedent for peacemaking, maybe urban ministry and so on. That's fine, but let's remember the city in question here is the capital city of the empire that has just taken them captive. They're surely tempted to resentment. Think a couple hundred years later of Jonah vis-a-vis another imperial invader, Nineveh. Doesn't want God to bless those people. Some are maybe drawn to principled resistance, like Christians today, who are sure that they're the prophetic ones standing against empire. On the other hand, eventually will come a contrary temptation to sell out, to totally assimilate, to enjoy the goodies of Babylon. Remember, again, it wasn't the Babylonian policy to take captives into chattel slavery, but to conscript the elites who could be the best and brightest, the civil servants. And Jeremiah is saying, embrace this. Contribute to the good of the very imperial power that has just taken you captive. Help them govern. Now, if there are some who are more inclined to kind of, I talk with Mennonites and social activists and even occasionally have conversations with Christian anarchists and might start to get afraid of where I'm going with this. Don't panic. The point is not to be subservient to the powers that be, because we got to also remember how it plays out in the book of Daniel. Now, the nature of the text, it's legendary quality with the lions and the fiery furnace, and that's part of what makes it a favorite among Sunday school teachers, right? But I also imagine Sabbath school teachers 2 millennia ago telling the story and having fun with it. But why did they tell it? To teach a lesson to a younger generation of Jews about living in this tension. Daniel, gifted, able to interpret dreams and so on, gives us a model for offering the best wisdom that your tradition has to the host society. Trust that God will vindicate you. But when vindication takes the form of promotions, rising in the ranks, upward mobility, happened with Daniel. Remember that you are an heir of Israel, professing the Shema, confessing the one God, refusing to bow down to the emperor's false claims of divine preeminence. Or like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also in the book of Daniel. They too serve willingly, but do not so assimilate that you forget your primary identity among the people that taught you God's Torah. Be prepared to suffer. God will accompany you through the fire. In other words, I repeat, find a way to be countercultural when necessary, pro-cultural as possible. You can do this when you remember who you are. Serving God first, not Caesar, not America. Don't make those your church. But do it discerningly, willing to serve, but accountable to your primary moral community, God's people. Is this kind of path going to be difficult? Of course, exquisitely difficult, but therefore also very creative. Because it trains God's people in skills they need to resist idolatry, but doesn't make resistance itself into another idol. It trains God's people in skills needed to serve the common good, but doesn't confuse social peace with God's peace. It requires people to become culturally bilingual, as the leaders of constructive social movements so often are. Now, by now you're wondering, what does all this have to do with immigration? So I'm going to start circling back. But by first continuing to think through, what does it mean to be Catholic? Hopefully the theological payoff. Contemporary Catholic social location loops us around to a whole set of contemporary social issues, including our present one, immigration, refugees, hospitality, also guesthood. We have Catholic in our name, after all, and one meaning of Catholic, certainly not the only one historically, but one meaning of Catholic is a global, cross-cultural people, a people that embraces many cultures. This should be obvious, so why hasn't it been obvious? Well, Catholic peoples for a long time lived mainly in Europe, in fairly static geographical enclaves. And even when some of them emigrated, I guess, to the US, they often tried to reproduce those enclaves here in North America. But to make a long story short in terms of how we're having to shift, I would argue that the Second Vatican Council, and I could cite Karl Rahner, a very important essay he wrote near the end of his life on this, but Vatican II itself was a recognition of Catholics living in more and more pluralistic societies and coming to terms with globalization. Pluralism such that the Catholic Church can no longer assume the conditions of establishment, being official religions in very many places in the world. So at Vatican II, the Church finally does endorse the principle of religious liberty, enters in more deeply into ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. Globalization, such that the Catholic Church must alternately recognize what were once mission churches are now fully equal dioceses in the world church, while the historic churches of Europe, and by now maybe the Americas, are themselves mission churches, called no less to engage in evangelization. In this context, major themes in Catholic social teaching that you could, have other series next year, Sunday at the Abbey next year about, any number, or maybe have had in the past. Issues of inequality, development, liberation where necessary. Peacemaking, responsibility to protect, but can we find ways to do it nonviolently? The call to global solidarity. The touchstone for many of these is, in fact, we're seeing as we hear Pope Francis urging, cajoling the churches to welcome migrants. At one point saying every parish, if we just in Europe, if it just would accept one refugee family, could make a huge difference. The obligation to welcome refugees and migrants with far more generosity than our societies and their elected representatives are generally ready to do. But then we hit the practical wall. The nations in which we live are less and less willing to be generous. What do we do about that? How do we negotiate borders? How do we work through the public policy impasse? I want to do one more 1-minute clip from Phil Steger, 5 months ago.
So just going to tell you tonight, I don't see an immediate solution to this dilemma. I think one is possible, but I can't tell you the political way to get there just yet. I don't quite have I do think I can't remember who it was that said, I'm blanking on it, but somebody said that all argument from now is really rhetoric. It's trying to find the right words that can untie the knots, and I think that's true. But I'm not going to promise that I'm going to find them tonight. I think what's happened is the strands of American hearts and minds have been tied together and cinched into a knot so tight that every tug ties it a little bit tighter. And what is going to be needed is some new words and a new spirit that's going to be able to slide in. It kind of reminds me of my Catholic dance, my Catholic grade school, middle school dances, Leave Room for the Holy Ghost. It was amazing the tight spaces the Holy Ghost could get into. So I think we need that kind of Holy Ghost who can get into those really tight spaces and try to open it apart and open up this knot.
I didn't show that for the joke, but it came along with us. So if Phil Steger, social activist and lawyer, working on immigration and refugee cases, is pessimistic about finding a political path to alternative policies in our current climate, how much less can I do that? What I'm trying to do instead, as you wrap up this series, is to at least help open up the knot by naming and rethinking some of the background assumptions we bring to the topic of immigration in the first place. I've already done a lot of that work by encouraging us to reimagine Catholic ecclesiology and social ethics from a social posture of diaspora, in which we're not always the people controlling the borders, but we still have to find a way to contribute to the common good. Maybe we're guests. Maybe we're always guests. If we're going to translate Catholic social teaching into public policy within a body politic that is fearful, subject to voices yelling that we should build that wall, we have to examine, challenge, and transform some of our deepest cultural assumptions. I'm tempted to say metaphysical assumptions about who we are in this world as God's creatures who are only here for a while, who kid ourselves when we think we control anything. We're going to have to give it all up. Well, let me see if I can take on the question of open borders. Rhetorically loaded charge that some of us favor open borders. Just open, let everybody in. A lot of Catholic social teaching arguments would, in fact, take us up pretty far that direction. Civil rights, citizen rights, legal rights, all derive from human rights. Human rights are prior. Which means that then the dignity of every person doesn't stop at the border. Or, Catholic celebration of family life. Family life held up and celebrated as the foundation of a healthy society. Foundation of social life, the wellspring of civic virtues, not the reverse. Family is prior to society and therefore to legal systems. All of this should then lead to a profound solidarity with those who not only flee political persecution, but desperately seek means to feed their families or simply seek a better life. Forgot I had these subpoints. Human rights prior to citizen rights, dignity of human person doesn't stop at the border, family prior to society. But then those can be kind of natural law arguments if you're into that part of Catholic baseball. But natural law arguments, which you notice then in letters from bishops and so on, they say all of this kind of opening up the way to much more generous policies towards immigrants. And then they say, but of course, nations have a natural right to control their borders. The question is whether that ends up, whether number one ends up, I think I meant to say number two trumps number one. Unless we're going to concede that the right to border control trumps everything else, and lets us violate more basic rights or ignore basic needs that turn out to be not so basic at all, we've got to do better than just have this yes but kind of framework. There's been a lot of work in the last few decades, and I just stopped the other day and took a picture of some of the things on my current reading shelf as I'm doing some writing about these topics. A lot of work among Christian ethicists on the ethics of hospitality. But I want to pursue the issue of whether we also come back to this issue of whether we also need an ethic of guesthood. And I'm going to pause for just a second here and admit I'm kind of at the edge of my currently thinking through and writing about these issues. So if there may be some dots yet to connect, maybe you can help me do it. I hope it's coherent, but if what I'm thinking through right now, this is going to be my last little section of this talk. A lot of work on Christian hospitality for some very good reasons. The obvious and totally important focus of almost all of these books is to encourage greater generosity, welcome toward other races, nationalities, ethnicities, other people of other religions. This is a very welcome development. But there are a couple of, I would say, sort of rough edges in here, or afterthoughts. You find people writing along, and then at the very end, well, got to say just a few more things. Sometimes it's, wait a minute, hospitality still assumes control of the space. Think of the problem that congregations and parishes have. When they're the majority culture and they really want to be more welcoming, more inclusive, and people of other races and cultures visit and they're welcomed. But why don't they always stay around? Well, you're welcome here, but we're not really going to change the way we do things, right? we're still the ones offering hospitality. There was a dissertation done a few years ago at Luther Seminary about this, about studying the experience of Christians who had migrated from other countries into the Twin Cities and often end up forming their own churches. Because, yeah, they're welcomed at mainstream churches, but not quite really. But then having said that, and before we launch into a well-meaning and idealistic dismissal of having any control, talk to anyone who has a serious ministry of hospitality, and you'll find them working on boundaries for their houses and working on rules and so on, or else they're going to get burned out. So maybe we do need borders. Bridge folk met last summer in Seattle, and we visited ministry of the Seattle Mennonite Church. I know you're not going to be able to read this. You can't even read it even if you had time. But I took a picture of it because it illustrates this so well. It was a shelter for homeless people in Seattle, and they had worked with I don't know what the best word is, the clientele, I don't quite like that word, but the homeless people that were participating in this to come up with rules. They themselves sensed a need for, well, there have to be some boundaries here. Or, you Benedictines are famous for your hospitality. My wife and I are enjoying it immensely being back here this weekend. But, when we walk around your campus, you come to a certain point and it says monastic enclosure, right? So borders are a dilemma. Identity politics is a dilemma. Here's a picture from Charlottesville last August of that makes me just want to go the other direction, not concede anything to an argument for borders, any need to protect cultural identity. These are the unite the right bros chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us" in Charlottesville. But then I remember my friends in Guatemala. I go fairly regularly to Guatemala. I was just there in January. Struggling to preserve their culture amid the pressures and acids of conquest centuries ago, colonization, capitalist development schemes trying to modernize them because they're a tug on the economy, now globalization. Obviously, there are power differentials between privileged white Americans and vulnerable indigenous cultures, and that's very relevant. But then how do you distribute power fairly? To say that one border or cultural boundary is legitimate and another is not may be right, morally, legally, etc., but politically, that doesn't get you very far. Precisely because identity is such a powerful force, a frontal challenge on other people's identities is only going to feed the flame and thus probably fail. I've gotten some help thinking this through from Rosemary Houghton. Any of you know her? I had kind of vaguely remembered the name, a very eloquent Catholic writer, 1996 essay on hospitality. Arguing that ownership is in fact a precondition for hospitality. At its simplest, I can't give a dinner party unless I can be sure that the means to cook it and the dishes to eat it off and the place where it is to be eaten are certain to be available to me. If I don't actually own them, then whoever does own them must make them available to me. I think. And remember, Rosemary Houghton is not a George Weigel, Michael Novak defender of capitalism, trying to recognize a very militant capitalism with Catholic social teaching. She has a serious track record of offering radical hospitality. Not Catholic worker, I don't think, but that kind of ministry. Might this mean that if I want Americans to be more hospitable, I might in some way have to be willing to recognize myself as a guest, sometimes in red state America? Trying to make someone hospitable just will not work, because I am then an intruder, not a guest. And the fact that I might wish to do this on behalf of those who have even less power or privilege than I do still does not mean that the strategy will work. I may just get the backs up of other people. Is there a way that I can offer hospitality even to those with whom I profoundly disagree? You know, the ones that Hillary Clinton very unwisely and unsympathetically called the deplorables. The goal of hospitality, many people have said, is to blur the line between host and guest, stranger and friend. Jesus is portrayed in some of the books that I showed you there as a supreme example of this. He enters into a house as a guest, a home of a Pharisee, a home of others, and pretty soon he's kind of hosting the event, right? But we're not Jesus. We're not Christ-like by rights. In other words, we don't have the same authority he had to begin as a guest and transform into host. We can't count on taking over the spaces into which we've been invited. Starting to move around the furniture, revise the menu, take over the kitchen. We do so only by willingly living as guests in other people's spaces as long as they choose. Now, admittedly, I'm not quite sure I like where this is going. But then I think of an Iraqi man interviewed in an NPR report about a year after, I think it was actually, they were doing a series on the anniversary of the US invasion, so 15 years ago. This Iraqi man was glad that Saddam Hussein had been overthrown, but he didn't want to be occupied by the Americans. Go home, he said, and then come back so I can be your host. This, I think, gives us a way to subvert the nationalist bigotry on display at Charlottesville, and can I say on camera, in the White House, and at the same time to defend the dignity, the land rights, the cultural identity, for example, of my Mayan friends and many other vulnerable peoples. There is a place for borders, for ownership, for a certain kind of control over one's space, personal space, communal space. Rosemary Houghton wasn't done in this essay. The very dangerous concept of ownership is also challenged and in some sense regulated and protected from abuse by the moral requirement of hospitality. Without ownership, there cannot be hospitality, but ownership becomes something different, legally, emotionally, morally, when it is governed by a question, ownership for what? And the answer is itself hospitality, of space, of ideas, of creativity. Which is to say, perhaps what Thomas Aquinas said of private property in his Summa. I think I want to apply it, what he says about private property, to that demarcator of national property we call borders. What was the justification for private property in Aquinas' thinking? It serves the common good. It must serve human thriving. The creation is God's gift to all, by natural law to be shared in common. But, he argues, the private property turns out to be the best way to manage and care for what all hold in common as a gift. So likewise, maybe borders are justified as necessary for wise and effective management, so that some people take care of some things with particular attention. But private property is not ultimate. Aquinas goes on to take the question, well, what if somebody steals because they're starving? And he says, in cases of need and hunger, quote unquote theft is not really even theft. For if the rational management that justifies private property has broken down, such that material gifts are no longer fulfilling the purpose of sustaining human life, then property reverts to common ownership. Likewise, if borders are not serving the shared good of humanity, all humanity, not just our people, wherever we are, I would suggest the same thing might have to apply. Borders aren't what is sacred. Human lives are what is sacred. In effect, while hospitality requires ownership, ownership is really always a lease, a temporary arrangement. And here's where I do get metaphysical. Life and land are ultimately God's gifts. All of us are going to have to relinquish our holdings sooner or later. Ownership and borders are interim social constructions, we say, we intellectuals say, but ultimately are illusions. I go to the Boundary Waters sometimes. The Boundary Waters, you know? One of my favorite places is Rose Lake. There are markers for the American, U.S. border and for the Canada border. But they're not on the border, they're on the shore. The only way I can know exactly where I am is I go out fishing on the lake and I've got a GPS and the map runs out because it's only for the U.S. side. And I know I'm sitting there right on the border. But that's just this electronic thing, running this program, connecting to GPS there's no line there, right? It's not ultimately real. It's a kind of a lease, a contract. For a while, for some generations, for some centuries, we're going to manage the land this way. But that means we're really guests. We don't have ultimate control of anything. Christians, as I've tried to demonstrate, have a long tradition to rediscover in order to train ourselves to live in diaspora. But our peace, our safety, our security comes through the strength of the relationships which we perpetually negotiate and renegotiate with the people around whom we live, in whose presence we live. Our security, our safety, our peace is not from the strength of our weapons or the height of our walls. Thank you.
Questions and observations, continuances.
Or if you sensed I wasn't quite connecting the dots there in that last section, help me out or point it out and I can keep working on it at least.
First of all, thank you. Especially appreciated the remark of Paul VI. When you were speaking, I remember something I learned from recently retired Professor Gary Prevost in political science. And when he was teaching John Locke said, when you mix human labor with natural resource, then that becomes yours. And so when you think ownership, once we're all immigrants, once we let in other immigrants and they participate and start to own your land, your company, then you're automatically releasing some of what you own so that they own it too. Again, hopefully for the common good. But I just kept thinking of Locke and you mixing human labor with a resource, and that is how he defined ownership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I said at one point, globalization is making us see what theologically I think should always have been true of the church. I would say something similar in response here about ownership. I mean, Locke could say it that simply when you imagine, a farmer working the land in a discrete space, the land and the property, and you produce something and it's yours. Who does that anymore? And did they ever do it really that way anyway? You still needed tools. We learn about discoveries of, where did I hear this? Probably NPR or some podcast. They were talking about recent discoveries of tools in Northern Europe made out of, this centuries, millennia ago, made out of materials that only naturally occur in Afghanistan. So, yeah, I don't think Locke has the whole story. My point is therefore, again, to reiterate, ownership. If I could kind of reinvent the English language and all the associations we have with it, I would wish that ownership we always just knew ownership means you've got a lease on it. You've got a contract for now. And that is relational. And so let's do better at negotiating those contracts and then renegotiating when there's new people around. And finding our security, not in expecting we can ever physically control anything, but let's build good relationships.
I don't know if I need a microphone.
For the sake of the camera, let's and the recording. Let's do that.
Just a comment. We talk about the Catholicity, we talk about the church, but we also have the same confusion. We have as much diversity of thought in the church, from being very conservative, if you will, very liberal, as you will, but it makes this whole topic more challenging and more controversial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have a further comment. I guess I would only say that no, I do have another comment. I teach a course at St. Thomas on global Christianity. My work on Catholic peace theology has taken me into this area, thinking about how do we live in solidarity across borders, and then, the church itself is a community, is a people that lives across borders, what I was talking about. So I've gotten interested in, and even though it wasn't my initial field of training, I've developed that. Well, one thing I try to get students to understand, although I think probably people like you are going to get it more quickly than 20-year-olds, is that the challenges of being in solidarity with each other across cultural lines in the global church are both an opportunity to learn the virtue of solidarity and an occasion to get some fresh resources. I mean, Pope Francis is only one example of many, what often happens in the global South. Christians generally, Catholics just as much in the global South, often defy our left-right, liberal, conservative categories. There may be frustratingly conservative, even harsh sometimes on personal morality. You can look at how the question of homosexuality has torn apart the Anglican Communion, all but torn it apart. But some of the same leaders sound like socialists when it comes to economic issues. We don't have to be always in these left-right categories forever. Encountering the global church, learning to be in solidarity, staying in relationship when you're frustrated with some of our brothers and sisters. Well, that's kind of what my book on unlearning Protestantism and stability was about. Sticking together even when we're pissed at each other.
Yes. How would you, relate the word stewardship to what you've spoken today?
Yeah, that's maybe a more common way of what I've been speaking about. Partly because of what I was getting from Rosemary Houghton, I was starting to think about ownership. But that would be another piece of the argument. We don't ever fully really control and own anything. We're just, I'd be glad to say also then, we're only stewards for a while of God's good gift to all of us. Do you see more advantage in that language?
Yes.
Okay. I get that it's probably a richer word theologically in many ways, but I'm trying to do something kind of narrow in the sense of that basic assumption that we own. Let's see if we can pick that apart. So. And of course, in this context, that we can never control borders very well, tightly, rigidly.
I think I want to say three things, but geezers sometimes get muddled. First, thank you so much for bringing us back to our own tradition. We Catholics are a peace church. It's just a lot of us have never heard about it seems. And I do appreciate so much that you have brought us back to that and continue to do so. I think the second was we sometimes get confused about what hospitality means and what guestship means. And I so much appreciate your reminding us that if we're going to do one, we need to do the other at very much the same time. I had the privilege of being guest master here for a few years, and it was one of the most beautiful gifts for a Christian monk to work at, because people bring hospitality when they come, and with any luck at all, they will leave feeling enriched. And so thank you for stressing those things as well. I think I'm at number 3, and this is where you finished your talk. So we have got a bigger button than anybody else, and we probably got bigger boomsticks than anybody else, and we have a president who says so. And
We as
And
U.S. citizens.
Americans right now. yeah.
Okay.
And so if we are going to work at hospitality and guestship and mutually being guests and hosts and stewards, what are we to do in the present day and any given conversation about the utterings, the dimensions presented to us by our leadership, so that we don't only do political stuff, but we can be Catholic and Christian and hosts and guests? Because I feel so bad when it comes down to grinding political arguments and fights. We can do better than that, but how do we get past the bigger button and do this?
I think I should just start my lecture over, because I think that's what I've been trying to answer. I'm not sure I have a way to say it again in a totally fresh way. But just to reiterate, to second what you're saying, I'm trying to, I so much appreciate people that work on policy, that work in St. Paul and Washington, D.C. and other places. But yeah, in that realm, you can only do some little adjustments, and where the big problems are often how we Americans, and I had to stop you there and say, well, are you talking Americans or Benedictines or Catholics or, hold on, let's stop and think, who's the we here? Do we automatically identify ourselves as anything? When I write, I'll often say, instead of identifying myself as an American, I don't know if anybody's noticed this, but I think about it. I'll say, I hold a U.S. passport. It's not that I am an American in anything but an ambiguous way. I'm a Christian. I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ first. My people is the church. Now, I don't want that to be a sectarian, snooty attitude towards other human beings, including my neighbors. And so I want to think about that. That's why I've set it up this way. The church is a transnational nation in diaspora, like those Jewish boys in the book of Daniel in Babylon, serving the good, but knowing who they are. So then in the area of immigration, I want to, I'm trying to, I should probably say to turn the camera off here, but no, it's all right. I'll own the words here. I'm trying to erode the assumption that this land is just ours to always be in control of. And so, I think it belongs to Mexicans too. In fact, when I travel to Texas or California, I'm tempted to say, oh, it's nice to visit here in occupied Mexico, but. But I get that that's why I say, I know that just to try to make a political argument that way is going to be counterproductive. So, I say it joking, but trying to at least get us to come at the issues from a different place. So.
Gerald, thank you for a wonderful. Thank you all for being here for this presentation and for many of the others as well. Keep your eyes and ears tuned for our series for next year. There are sources of carbohydrates and liquid.